Make sure both of y'all's mics are on.
On. Yeah.
And if it's too hot, I'll run back there and adjust that as we get started.
Okay.
All right. Well, welcome, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. I was telling these guys just a minute or two ago that we really need Johnny and Carrie Ann Malloy here because nobody wants to sit in the front row. So y'all feel so far away, but it's good. I am glad that y'all are here, and this is really, and it's a continuation of a lot of what we've been doing with Equip over the last 2 years or so, but this is really specifically a continuation of what we did in April, or I think it was April, our last one when we talked about addictions. It's these same two guys talking about that, and so we're kind of doing round two, talking about anxiety and depression. And our hope for tonight is that really that each of you and each of us grows in having biblical knowledge about this, and having biblical hope about this, and in having biblical guidance about this. So how does the Bible inform our knowledge, our hope, and our guidance about anxiety and depression? And I think as, I don't know, it was pretty quick after we did the addictions one that we started thinking about kind of doing a follow-up on that, kind of in a similar format, but about a different topic with anxiety and depression. And I think a lot of what has led us to that is just anxiety and depression is a very common thing, right? It's something that in lesser or greater levels that we all have some touch point with, whether that's in our own lives or the lives of somebody around us. And so I trust that that's true for you all because y'all are here. So you probably didn't come here if you didn't think it was worthless. So what we're going to do is these two guys will teach and give some content. I'll kind of moderate that a little bit. And then we've got two testimonies that about midway through or so, we'll have two folks come up and share that. And then at the end, like we did last time, we're going to have a Q&A time. And so if there are questions that you have as we're going through this, you can write those down or send yourself a text or whatever you need to do that. And we'll have a link, and I'll share that link once we get going a little bit. We'll have a link where you can just kind of send those in and we can read them off the computer and go from there. But let me pray and we'll dive in. Father, you are our good God who cares for us, and we are reminded, we remember your care and watch over us. Father, help us to grow, to have a biblical view and perspective on anxiety and depression. Pray for your guidance for us tonight. I pray for Bill and Dustin. I thank you for the knowledge you've given these brothers. I thank you for ways that you have equipped them, and just pray that you would use these brothers to bless us tonight. Lord, give us ears to hear. Give us hearts to believe as we think about this tonight, we pray in Christ's name. Amen. So we'll dive in. And so I know all of y'all know these guys, but Dustin Clark, Bill Losing are two of our elders here getting to share about this. And so let's just start out, have each of y'all share a little bit of what has been your experience with anxiety and or depression, whether that's in your own life or whether that's kind of helping other people. Just give a little bit of your experience with that.
You want to start?
Sure, I can start. That's fine. Break the ice. I've had experience on both sides of this issue of trying to help people with anxiety and depression, and also being afflicted with those things myself for a long time. Most of my adult life, maybe a good deal of my childhood also. I don't really know, but so I sort of think in some ways really what qualifies me to talk much about this is my experience with it. Not necessarily that I have a vast fund of knowledge concerning anxiety and depression and everything that it can be, or all the theories of it, but just as someone who's lived it, and kind of much like the addiction issue that we did back in the spring. And so, really underneath all of that that sort of stuff that we talked about, people are generally treating some form of emotional pain that they want to escape from.
Sometimes it feels like a train.
It feels like a train, can feel like a train bearing down on you, that's right. Yeah, so this whole topic kind of just dovetails with that topic pretty nicely. And I don't know of anyone who enjoys the experience of pain, and everybody wants to find some way out of it, if possible. It's these things are really strange, because in some ways you feel like your mind has betrayed you, and you begin to question whether or not the thoughts in your own mind are yours, and are they true, and how did they get there, and how do you make them stop, and how do we get past all of this? Can be very difficult. But there's no easy answer to any of it, I think. Some of the solutions may be simple, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're easy. And I guess we will get into that at some point tonight. But in much of what I do, as a doctor, people come to me because they have suffering most of the time, and that suffering is attached to oftentimes some disease process that's going on, and maybe I can or maybe I can't offer some help for whatever particular disease process they're suffering from, but finding some way to be able to eliminate the suffering, which is what they don't like, what they don't want. Having a broken arm is inconvenient, and it's gonna affect your life in some ways over the next few weeks. But if it doesn't bother you in your mind, you don't grieve over the loss of the things that you're not going to be able to do and all that sort of stuff. You suffer much less. So it's really been an interesting thing in my career to see how mental suffering and physical issues are intertwined with one another.
I would say that I don't think that I've experienced depression. I think there have been times when I've been extremely sad. There's times when I've been fearful or anxious. I've definitely experienced that. And as a pastor, over the years, I've talked with a lot of people who feel very depressed. And one of the things that I've been learning is that there's a whole range and spectrum of experiencing those things. And part of what we'll do in a few minutes is give some definitions. I think that can be very helpful to know more specifically what you're wrestling with, because people throw around terms as if, people will all the time say, I'm depressed, but that doesn't necessarily mean a full-on depression of feeling paralyzed and like you're laying on the bed and there's a huge bag of sand on you. There's just weight, and there are very extreme things that people experience, and so we want to define some terms. I think that'll help us. But my main involvement with this would be more along the lines of fears and anxieties, and then trying to help people who are experiencing these things. So I've been trying to do a lot of study about that to learn more.
Yeah. And so I had the privilege of sitting with these guys, I guess over 2 or 3 lunches, I can't remember, getting to talk through this stuff. And one of the things that was really important early on in this was hope.
Yes.
So Bill, why don't you start us out and just kind of, we're going to start talking about hope, then we're going to get into kind of the nitty gritty, and then we're going to come back to that as well. So give us some thoughts on hope in this.
I think it's really important that we start with hope. And if you were taken notes, well, what I have in my notes is hope in the darkness. And the reason I put those two together is because I think hope is so critical in knowing how to deal with any of these things, but also the reality of the darkness. Depression is a real thing. And it's not just, well, you're not strong enough to hold up. It is a paralyzing thing, and it feels like great, great darkness. Ed Welch is a biblical counselor who has written a lot of books, and in one of his books, he makes the point that depression really needs to be understood through the lens of suffering. It is suffering. It is something that hurts and can, again, paralyze you or really cause a lot of difficulties. So I want to start there by saying there is hope in the darkness. There's a bunch of scripture we could look at. I'll just refer you to two. Probably most of you know Romans 8:28. God causes all things to work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Please don't forget verse 29 that follows that, where Paul says that God's purpose is to make us more and more conformed to the image of Christ. So there's not just an empty or an open-ended promise from God that things are always going to get better. You know, the sun will come out tomorrow. That's not what God promises. What he promises is that he's going to make each of his children more and more like Jesus. So everything we go through is a part of that process. That should give us hope, that we may not be able to find all the answers for why we're experiencing what we're experiencing. But if the end result is that we become more like Jesus, it's worthwhile, even if it's incredibly painful. The other passage that I think really helps about hope is in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, in verses 8 through 11. Paul says, I don't want you to be unaware of how badly we suffered in Asia. He says it got so bad we despaired even of life. And then he says, but this happened so that we would learn to rely on God and not ourselves. In fact, I think the way Paul says it actually is, this was so that we would not rely on ourselves, but on the God who raises the dead. For the Apostle Paul to despair of life, it must have been a bad, bad thing that they went through. He was shipwrecked how many times? He received the 39 lashes from the scribes and Pharisees. How many times? He was stoned multiple times. One time, they thought he was dead, dragged him out of the city, and left him laying on the road. He had experienced a lot of suffering, but there was something about this that was unique, apparently. And that encourages me in two ways. For one, to know that even Paul suffered a lot, but also to know that even Paul had things to learn. It's not always sin that brings about depression or worry or anxiety. Sometimes sin is involved. But the most important thing about going through those things is for God to reveal more of himself to us. That's the purpose behind it. Even if we can't fully understand it, we may never, this side of heaven, be able to explain it. But there are things that God is teaching us. And Paul, as mature as he was, as knowledgeable as he was, as faithful as he was, he still had more to learn about relying on God and not himself. So if Paul had more to learn, I've got more to learn. Probably you do too. So there is hope to be found even when we're going through hard things, specifically fears, worry, anxiety, depression. There's hope even there. So I want to start with that.
That's good. Good. Well, one of the things we want to do here is give some definitions to some words. And as we give definition, one of the things that we need to do is give distinction. Because there's a lot of words in, I think, even as you've referenced, as we use them or as we talk with others, sometimes all these words just kind of combine and they don't have any distinction between them. But I think that biblically, that we need to have some distinction between some words and how we think about them. And so I'm just going to throw out some of these words and I'm going to turn it over to y'all to just give any thoughts that y'all want to give on this idea. But you can think in the realm of depression, there's depression, but there's sadness, there's melancholy, there's sorrow. How do those different things relate? How are they different? In the realm of anxiety, you have fear, you have stress, you have worry. You kind of think, are all those the same, or are they different in some ways, and how do they relate? There could be some other words we throw in there too. But yeah, why don't y'all just speak to that for a little bit?
Do you have any you want to start with? Or?
Any that I want to start with? I'm just kind of working off the list
Okay.
that you had
Well-
already, but I have some definitions from the American Psychological Association, and so I wanted to kind of see
Yeah.
how these things match up.
Yeah, okay. Why don't I give a stab and then you
Okay.
correct or edit as needed. I think one general thing we have to understand, first of all, is our emotions. You know, what are emotions? And I think a right definition would be our emotions are our response to things around us, and it's based on whether we think those things are good or bad. You know, why do we get angry about certain things? Well, we think that something is wrong. If we didn't think it was wrong, there wouldn't be anger rising in us. There are a variety of reactions we can have based to how we think. If you think the most important thing in the world is to have a life where there's not much frustration, then anytime you run into anybody else, you're going to be on the edge of getting mad, because we all can do things to frustrate each other's plans. Some people are more easygoing, some people are very uptight. Why is that? Well, it's because of how they think about the things going on around them, and how they think about it affects their emotions and how they respond. Do you think that's fair? You want to?
Yeah, I
Add
think
to
that's
that
a good way of explaining emotions. Essentially, I think it has to be a personally significant matter or event. I mean, there are all sorts of things taking place around us every day that we don't.
Yeah.
Who cares? I mean, it doesn't matter to me. I'm not personally involved, or somehow see myself personally involved. But for something to make you become emotional, it has to have some significance to you in some way. And whatever emotion pops up kind of generally tends to be based on the event that's going on. If it's somebody pulls a gun on you, well, it's probably going to be fear. And later on there may be other emotions that are attached to that, but generally emotions follow a pretty definite pattern of exposure to events.
Yeah. I think one important thing too about emotions is a lot of people think, well, I can't do anything about my emotions, they're just there, I just feel. But the reality is we may not be able to entirely change them, but we can affect them. Just for example, you're at home having a disagreement with your spouse, and things are pretty heated, and your phone rings and you look and it's Pastor Jim. Well, hi, Pastor Jim, how are you today? Right? We can shut it off just that quick. Or we're real frustrated at work, but we don't say anything, and then we come home and we bite our kids' heads off, and why? Why did we do? Well, we controlled our emotions all day long and didn't react, didn't say anything, and now we're just going to let loose on anybody who interrupts our plans in the slightest way or inconveniences us, So we can control our emotions somewhat. Sometimes it's by what we think may be the result of it. Sometimes it's because we've just tried to stuff it, and we can't anymore. It's going to explode. It's going to come out. And so it's important to know that about our emotions too.
That's great example of that. How would you distinguish stress from anxiety?
Good question. I think stress is our response to a situation that we don't feel adequate for, usually, in some form or another, either time or resources, or there's something that's pushing us beyond what we're normally able to do. So stress can be a good thing or a bad thing. Our immune systems, right? They need to be challenged and pushed to get stronger and better. Our muscles have to be challenged and pushed. They have to be under stress in order to become more healthy. So yeah, I think the big question about stress is why? Why do we feel the stress? And if you can identify that, that'll help you know. Is it a positive stress, a negative stress? Is it something I should be worried about or shouldn't be worried about? You kind of have to ask. ask questions.
What about in the other camp, so to speak, of depression? How is depression the same as or different from sadness?
I'll take a stab at that one. In some ways, all of these labels of mental health disorders have this caveat that it has to be intense enough that it interferes with your life in a significant way, and sort of what's significant is somewhat subjective, I guess. But people are, we can become sad over lots of different things, and but it, we may be able to continue to go on, and it's sort of short-lived, and there's not a lot of problems with the rest of life going forward just because we're sad. Depression, can be a situation of just being completely despondent, and generally that's kind of, it can run a range of intensity, from feeling just generally unhappy all the time, but totally despondent, where folks don't want to get out of bed, and they don't want to get dressed, and they don't want to interact with people, and so it begins to interfere with life completely at that point. I mean, it can be triggered from an event that causes sadness. Grief is a great example. When does grief become something other than grief, and it's depression or whatever else? And it's sadness is an appropriate response to things that happen in our world, happen to us, or happen to others. Depression is just sort of on a next level, and may or may not be particularly linked to an event.
Some of the folks that I've talked with and some of the things that I've read include an element of feeling numb. That's part of depression, where there's not the intense feelings about anything. There's just kind of a numbness, and there seems to be a darkness all the time, or a weight. It's that sense of being crushed and trapped. Those are some of the words that I have heard or read that describe it. So yeah, a lot deeper than sadness. I mean,
Yeah, and it sounds like just like a sense of helplessness in there with it too. So, Dustin, one of the things you mentioned over lunch one day was something to the effect that people aren't just anxious in general. Like they're not just like, I'm just anxious, period. Like there's always anxious about something, right? Am I capturing that?
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary of what I said, I think. I mean, it's sort of one of these ideas of, like, can you have an emotion without having a thought attached to it? And maybe it's possible that you can. I don't experience life that way, but there's an interplay back and forth. If you're feeling bad, you tend to think worse thoughts. If you're feeling better physically, your thoughts are happier and more pleasant, more positive. And that's sort of maybe where we get into the realm of what's the difference between fear and anxiety, or panic, or any of those other situations. Fear is a normal response that we have to a potentially threatening situation, whether that's a bodily threat, whether that's some other kind of threat. You might be fearful if you're going to get fired from your job. You're not physically going to get hurt, but a lot of bad stuff's going to happen because you lost your job. So a response to a threatening situation. If you're out running and you see there's a dog on the loose and you have that sick feeling in your stomach and you really want to get out of there. Well, I mean, that's an appropriate response. Fear, God gave us fear to preserve life. And as you can see, each of those situations is connected to something very specific. And so we have thoughts about that. This, me losing my job means this, or this. This crazy dog not locked up and coming at me means, he's going to eat me or whatever else. So those are all connected to very specific thoughts. Sometimes when people are dealing with anxiety, they say, well, I don't know what I'm anxious about necessarily. And oftentimes what's happened is it's gone from, it's just become generalized. It's gone from being concerned or worried about certain particular things, and maybe it was just here, and now it becomes here, and then here, and here, until pretty soon the entire future is just scary. Yeah. Tomorrow is just scary because everything in the world is a threat now, and everything is threatening. And so that's when it becomes difficult for people to sort of pinpoint, oh, well, I'm thinking about this possible bad outcome, and that's why I'm anxious. Everything's a bad outcome. Yeah. Everything's what if.
Yeah. It really does seem like there's a progression there when you go fear, worry, anxiety, and anxiety can become more severe. One thing I read pointed out, like fear is a specific danger that's right in front of you. Worry is you're concerned about something that you think may happen to you, and you have a pretty good idea of what it is that you're worried about. And then as it moves into anxiety, now you don't know what it is. It's just something terrible is going to happen to someone you love. And it can grow and blossom and just very quickly lead on into depression. You're powerless. You feel powerless to do anything. You just know it's got to be something bad is about to happen.
And that's, it's probably most concretely seen in people that won't leave their homes or won't leave a particular room of their home. I don't know if any of you know people like that. They're obviously not very social, so maybe you don't know them. But this happens over time. I do know some people like this, and they're not going outside. Everything is scary. Or they're not coming out of this bedroom because everything is scary. And they couldn't necessarily say, oh, these particular things are scary. It's anything and everything is scary.
Well, one more question before we move on to the next section, unless y'all want to add more. But are anxiety and depression two sides of the same coin, or are they totally different animals, or whatever option C is? I don't know.
I'll let you start.
I think I kind of like the imagery of a spectrum. So it's kind of like progressing deeper and deeper into a darkness. I think I like that better than two sides of a coin, because I see connections there all the way through, kind of building more and more.
I think of them in terms of anxiety is almost always future-oriented. So that's something that's going to happen in the future, whether that's possibly going to happen or it actually is going to happen. That remains a future-oriented situation. Depression doesn't necessarily have to be future-oriented. Sometimes it's full of regrets and locked on to things that are in the past in a lot of ways. I think it's hard to, I don't often see people who are highly anxious for long periods of time that don't end up with a lot of features of depression as well. And that's as described one of the subsets of depression, anxious depression. People can be both at the same time.
Well, let's think about kind of where anxiety and depression come from. So, what causes